Good morning and welcome to our coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. I am Bukola Koka, and coming up on the program, Israel-Hamas agreed to 4-day humanitarian pause brokered by Qatar, subject to extension. We're at war and we will remain at war, Netanyahu says ahead of cabinet meeting. Five Palestinians killed in West Bank's Tulkrum in Israeli strike. And we begin this morning with cheering news that Israel and Hamas have agreed a deal to release 50 hostages, women and children being held in Gaza during a 4-day pause in fighting. If successful, it will be the first break in fighting since the war broke out 6 weeks ago. Hamas says the deal will allow hundreds of lorries of humanitarian, medical and fuel aid to enter all parts of the Gaza Strip, adding that 150 Palestinian women and children will be released from Israeli jails under the deal. The Qatari Foreign Ministry, which brokered the deal along with Egypt and the US, says it is subject to extension, the starting time of which will be announced within the next 24 hours. The Abu Maria Palestinian family in the West Bank are voicing their joy and optimism after watching the TV and waiting for news of a hostage deal between Israel and the Islamic militant group Hamas that could see their teenage son return home. Yusuf and Fida Abu Maria say they are hopeful of seeing their teenage son, Ubay, return home after he was arrested in August and jailed last month. Ubay is serving a 6-month sentence. Israel's government met into the early hours of Wednesday to consider a deal for Palestinian Hamas militants to free some hostages in Gaza in exchange for a multi-day truce and the release of a greater number of Palestinian prisoners in Israel. Happy but worried was how 63-year-old Gilad Kongold described his feelings after news broke of the truce and hostage deal between Israel and the Islamic militant group. Kongold is an Israeli grandfather of 7 missing family members believed to be the hostages of Hamas. Kongold's 38-year-old son, Tal Shahom, daughter-in-law, Adi, their 2 children, Nave, 8, and Yahel Gani, 3, Adi's mother, Shoshan, aunt Sharon, and a 12-year-old niece, Noam, were believed to have been taken by Hamas gunmen from Israel. Kongold said despite the positive development and renewed hope for most of his missing family members, it worried him that his son would likely remain in Gaza.
One side, I'm happy. Second, I'm worried, okay, because nobody told me that my family will be in this deal. Okay, there was 40 children inside Gaza, and they go to release only 30. Where are the others? I don't know, and I hope that everybody will release. Until yesterday, it's pretty same. Until all the hostages were released, we didn't stop. We continue day on, day off to protect the right of the hostages. It's terrible 7 weeks. I think it's never happened in my life for sure, but in the history of the human being, like too many hostages, too many children, too many babies, too many women. I don't know how I feel. Right now, I want to be sure that my family will release, at least the grandsons and my daughter-in-law, and then we continue. I go to hug them, kiss them, and I hope probably they will be in hospital in the first time to get the checkup and everything. But I don't know. I didn't think what I got to do and what I'm going to say.
Earlier, Gilad Kongold was glued to the television waiting for news of the hostage deal between Israel and Islamic militant group Hamas. He could not be described as happy then, but there was no shortage of worry. He explained how sleep has been elusive since his 7 members of his family disappeared.
Nobody can imagine how we feel, okay? Imagine that your kid instead sleep in the bed with blanket and it's underground, deep. It's deep tunnels, 3 years old. My granddaughter, she's loved to jump all the time, trampoline and the couch, and she's very happy. There is a baby, 11 months, that need to start to work. Sleep, I need to take sleeping pills, strong one, so at least 4 or 5 hours I sleep. If not, I can handle it. We need to know if they're alive, if they're okay. It's the minimum. The minimum. This is a war crime. They're civilians. We ask release the children and the women at once. Okay, it's impossible to bargain with children. Okay, no food, no gasoline, no solar, nothing. Okay, children and women must be released immediately. I want everybody back, but I think, and it's a very tough decision, but I think the children and women must be, they are most fragile, they need to get out.
A group of relatives of hostages held by Hamas militants met Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu asked his government to back a deal to clear the way for the release of some of the hostages. Speaking after presenting the still undisclosed details of the deal to his war cabinet and the wider national security cabinet, Netanyahu told his government it was a difficult decision, but the right decision, and would enable Israel to go on fighting Hamas. He said the intervention of US President Joe Biden had helped to improve the deal so that it included more hostages for fewer concessions. The group of relatives are scheduled to meet Pope Francis before his weekly general audience. The Pope will separately meet with a group of Palestinians with family members in Gaza later on Wednesday. And earlier, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, along with Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz, had held a cabinet meeting to discuss the hostage release deal. In a recorded message at the start of a government meeting, Netanyahu said the war would continue until Israel achieved all its goals. And still, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu asked his government on Tuesday, November the 21st, to back a deal to clear the way for the release of some of the hostages that Palestinian Hamas militants took to the Gaza Strip during an October 7 assault on Israel. In a recorded message at the start of a government meeting, Netanyahu vowed the war would continue until Israel achieved all its goals. A U.S. official had said the deal will include a 4 or 5 day ceasefire, the first pause in 6 weeks of an Israeli bombardment of Gaza. Speaking after presenting the still undisclosed details of the deal to his war cabinet and the wider national security cabinet, Netanyahu told his government it was a difficult decision, but the right decision, and would enable Israel to go on fighting Hamas. And 5 Palestinians were killed and others injured in Tulkam camp in the occupied West Bank in an Israeli drone. That's according to the official Palestinian news agency Wafa on Wednesday. The agency added that the Israeli military conducted a raid on the emergency department in the Thabet government hospital in Tulkam. And now we're joined by security expert Chidi Nwanu. He is joining us virtually from London. Mr. Nwanu, good to have you on the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with cheering news that has come in this morning about the truce between the warring parties, the release, specifically about the release of 50 hostages, and on the Israeli side, agreeing to release 150 Palestinian prisoners. How fragile is this truce?
Well, all truces are fragile until they're concluded, but this one, has several issues. The key one being the level of trust on each side. But that's a threat. But there are also, there are some good strengths to this. But the key threat is that on both sides, there are elements who do not want this truce to go ahead. On the Palestinian side, be it factions within Hamas, factions within the Palestinian Authority, or allies of the Palestinians, for whom the continuation of the hostage crisis, the continuation of the war is a benefit to them, or at least they see benefits in it for themselves. So there is that risk for the Palestinian side that there might be disruptors who will try and stop it from going ahead. Then likewise, from the Israeli side, there are many elements for whom this war is, in their mind, existential and almost a kind of a religious duty, the same way as there are people like that on the Palestinian side, for whom any sort of a deal with Hamas or any sort of a deal with the Palestinians is an anathema. And many of them, and some of them are in the Israeli cabinet. It's politically difficult for them to challenge it, but it could be possible for them to try and put one or two problems in the way to spoil it. But all things being equal, I think both sides desperately need this truce. Hamas needs the truce to provide relief to the people of Gaza as much as it cares about them, and also to give itself some breathing space from the bombardment it's taking from the Israelis. Likewise, the Israeli government in particular needs to show its people that it's working to bring back the hostages. It needs to give them a victory. And all they're showing them day after day is just the destruction of Gaza. That doesn't mean anything when, over 200 Israelis are there. So there's benefits on both sides, but there's also potential spoilers on both sides.
Speaking of potential spoilers, could Hamas have been more magnanimous in this deal? I mean, the Israelis have agreed to release 150 Palestinian hostages, but Hamas has only released 50, contrary to the offer it made earlier about releasing 70 in exchange for a 5-day truce.
Well, again, if we're looking at this objectively, you've got to bear in mind that historically, in return for a single Israeli soldier, previously the Israelis released several thousand. And that was a soldier who, by definition, is a prisoner of war. These are civilian hostages. So Hamas's strongest card right now are those hostages. And as barbaric and heartless as it sounds, the less they release per negotiation round, because unfortunately, almost all these hostages will be released by negotiation. There won't be any, there'll be, forget what we see in the movies. It's not going to be some dramatic rescue, most likely. Most of these hostages will be released by negotiation. So as many rounds as Hamas can get out of the Israelis, and more of their people they can get out, more pauses they can get, more humanitarian aid, the better it is for them. So it's very unlikely you're going to see anything beyond blocks of 50 to maybe, if we're lucky, 100 prisoners being released. So this is unfortunately the way the situation is. It's not going to, we're not going to see big bunches of people being released. It's always going to be this kind of fraction. But the hopeful thing is that what's in this round are women, children, infants, the elderly. Those vulnerable people will be released.
Mr. Nwonu, it's difficult not to share the optimism of families of hostages and their worry as well. How would they be striking a balance between those two emotions at this point in time, particularly because in the days to this deal being agreed to by both parties, we had begun to see news about bodies of some of the hostages being discovered in the war area in Gaza. What's the guarantee that, some family members amongst the 240 hostages are still alive?
Well, this is the problem, and as I alluded to earlier, when this bombardment is going on, many of the likely victims will be the hostages, because they will be co-located with the Hamas fighters. So whatever positions that the Israelis attack or bomb, there is a likelihood that hostages will be there. So there's most likely a probability that many hostages have been killed in the attack so far. Now, this is again part of the questions that one would ask as to why the Israelis chose to go in so heavily in the first place, when they could have, maybe done a slightly more surgical operation where they attempted to focus on, negotiating for the release of the hostage or isolating Hamas and then going for the hostages. But they chose to go in heavy with lots of bombardments, and that's, the part of the price of that is going to be death of hostages. One would hope that there not too many have been killed, but we won't find out until the conclusion of the negotiations and the conclusion of the conflict.
Speaking of Israel's strategy, in prosecuting this war, two in one now. Maybe we should start with one. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said categorically, also this morning, that Israel will go ahead with this war until its goal is achieved. So are we seeing a conflict that is yet to be resolved, regardless of this truce that has been brokered? And what strategy, perhaps, do you think the IDF would adopt in prosecuting this war, particularly as it has already taken control of northern Gaza? But before the truce, reports were to the effect that it was advancing to the southern part of that region.
So we have to distinguish between the operation that's taking place right now that the IDF is prosecuting in Gaza and the war, as we would call it, in the wider sense. Because the war is a large, amorphous activity. It doesn't just involve, Hamas or Gaza. This is obviously going back to before the Israeli War of Independence, to the Zionist movement, the settlement of Palestine, the colonization of Palestine first by the Turks, by the Romans. It is a long, historical event that, this is just one tiny chapter in it, a tragic chapter, but a tiny chapter in it. And before we talk about the resolution of the war, there obviously has to be a grand strategic, Palestinians in their history. As we said, don't want this. They want their own exclusive views to the detriment of others. So operationally, I would say that the IDF, many of us, again, I'm just sitting in a chair in London. I'm not in Gaza, so it's not for me to criticize the people fighting this battle. But the IDF strategy, to me, has been very problematic. Destroying Gaza, displacing a lot of people, creating a massive problem that is going to come back to haunt you. Because not only is the psychological issues of the thousands or tens of hundreds of thousands of people who have their family members, you've also got the problem of the actual physical destruction of Gaza.
It's been increasingly difficult to hear you, Mr. Warren, in the last 2 to 3 minutes towards the end of that conversation. I hope you're back, but if not, we'll have to suspend it until we sort out the connection problem. If it's possible to return to you. Okay, I'm told that you're back now. It was difficult to hear you for much of the last bit of the conversation, but I'll progress to ask that this truce, are you worried that it could empower Hamas, particularly because of the many discoveries about its capability that the IDF has unveiled amid this war? To what extent will this 4-day truce strengthen its, war chest to continue with this war after perhaps it's suspended?
So this truce is unlikely to give Hamas a great advantage other than a pause, other than a break, the ability to rest, as it were, move some troops, move some men, move some stocks. The people they're getting back in exchange are women and children. They're not getting any fighters. So they're not necessarily getting anything great from this other than a pause. And I believe that once this truce is over, the Israelis will continue their operation with even more force. So it's beneficial to Hamas, to not necessarily operationally on the field, other than, as I said, the benefits of having a pause, which is always nice. The benefit is that they have forced the Israelis to negotiate. They have forced the Israelis to abandon one of their objectives, which is to compel Hamas to their will by force. Instead, they have been compelled to negotiate, give Hamas something in exchange for something they want. So this strategically is a win for Hamas. They're negotiating with the nation states almost on an equal level. And that's the big strategic win for Hamas. Operationally, other than operational pause and the ability, and the fact that some people will not die for the next 4 days, that's about as much as there is.
All right, Mr. Chidinwonu, we'd like to thank you very much for your time and contributions on the program this morning. We look forward to another time that we'll have you for more. Thank you so much. Mr. Chidinwonu is a security expert who joined us from London. And still to come on the program, EU says no evidence of aid for Palestinians going to Hamas. We'll have that story and more coming your way after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. The bodies of two journalists working for a Lebanese TV channel were brought back to Beirut hours after being killed in an Israeli strike near the border. This news was shared by the Lebanese state media and the channel Al Mayadeen, which added that the incident happened on Tuesday. Colleagues gathered to meet the ambulances returning the bodies to Al Mayadeen's office in the Lebanese capital. The deaths add to a toll of more than 50 journalists killed, covering the war between Israel and Hamas and its spillover to other parts of the region since October the 7th, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. Al Mayadeen claims the Israeli strike near the town of Tir Harfa, about a mile from the Israeli frontier, had deliberately targeted the TV crew because the channel was known to be pro-Palestinian and pro-Iran's regional military alliance. The European Commission, in a review of its development aid to Palestinians, says it found no evidence of funds going to Hamas and its program would continue without delay. The new update was provided by Commission Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the review had been necessary following the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel.
You found no indications of EU money having directly or indirectly benefited the terrorist organization Hamas. The review found that the control system in place has worked. As a result, payment to Palestinian beneficiaries and UNRWA will continue without payment delays. Finally, for those projects in Gaza that are not feasible due to the war, money will be reallocated to Gaza either as humanitarian or development aid.
The Israeli army has released two pictures of what it says is a Hamas tunnel underneath the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza. At one point, a shelter for tens of thousands of Palestinian war refugees, Al-Shifa hospital has been evacuating patients and staff since Israeli troops swept in last week on what they called a mission to root out hidden Hamas facilities. On Sunday, the Israeli military published video of what it described as a tunnel running 55 meters in length and dug by Palestinians 10 meters under the Shifa compound. While acknowledging that it has a network of hundreds of kilometers of secret tunnels, bunkers and access shafts throughout the Palestinian enclave, Hamas has denied that these are located in civilian infrastructure like hospitals. Let's speak now with former lecturer on diplomatic and consular relations law, Nasarawa State University, KEFI, Mr. Chukwuemeka Eze. Mr. Eze is speaking to us virtually from Enugu in southeast Nigeria. Welcome to the program, Mr. Eze.
Thank you. Good morning.
Indeed, a very good morning to you. So what would be first would be apt to ask your immediate reactions about the truce agreed between both warring factions, the release of 50 hostages on the part of Hamas and 150 Palestinian prisoners on the part of Israel.
It has been long in expectation. We've been expecting this to happen, and certainly Hamas have done it in the past. Whenever it takes hostages, it knows that Israel so far has so much commitment to its citizens. And there is no way they will take Israeli hostages and Israel will not do something by way of exchange. Even the Yahya Sinwar, that is currently the head of Hamas in Gaza, was released from prison several years ago through this type of exchange. So it was long expected that we'll get to this point. But what will happen to the remaining hostages is something for us to consider in due course. But for now, I think it is worthwhile. Women and children from this 50, and they should be released. They should not be held in captivity. It is high time they are released to get back to their parents, so that our husbands, so that negotiations for the remainder will continue. And this accompanying ceasefire is also good for both sides to have a rethink. May also lead to consolidation of preparation for further wars. So I think there is definitely, it cannot be predicted what will happen. The fight may get more intense after the ceasefire, but let's watch and see.
And from past patterns of conflict between Israel and Hamas, can you say that Hamas would honor future agreements by releasing the remaining hostages? And from past patterns as well, can we also say that there is any guarantee whatsoever that the remaining hostages are indeed alive and can be accounted for?
I think the U.S. has requested for information on the whole hostages, and I think it will be released in due course. But whether they are alive or not is what nobody can fathom now. As for whether Hamas will release the remainder if they are alive, certainly Hamas will require a lot of. Hamas will be asking for the release of thousands of Hamas fighters in in Israeli prisons. So how the negotiation will go to be very tough, because the number they will be requesting may be more than Israel will be ready to release. So that one will be very tough. I see Hamas requesting for thousands of prisoners, and Israel may be asking that hundreds be released. For them to release a ratio of 3-to-1 now, when it gets to the remaining hostages, definitely Hamas will be asking for maybe 10-to-1, and Israel may find it difficult to accede to that. But because of their love for their citizens, Israel, it seems, can do anything to have their citizens back, because the local pressure is very high. The local pressure, in fact, the government may fall if those hostages are not released. And Hamas usually play on the psyche of the Israelis when they are handling this type of issue. So let's see how Egypt and Qatar and the US will influence the two sides to have a deal on the remainder. But let this one take place as we look out for it.
Now, amid this war, we hear this morning that the European Commission is saying that in its review of development, there is no evidence of funds going to Hamas. Is this sort of a way to absolve Iran of its purported support for the Hamas militant group?
No. It has nothing to do with that. Recall that the EU sent these funds not to Hamas. They send it to Fatah, which is in control of Ramallah and West Bank, which the Israelis call Judea and Samaria. So it is not funds sent directly to Hamas, but it may be, once it is sent to PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, you can no longer determine conclusively whether they will decide to send part of it to Gaza. The European Union has said that no part of that money has been sent to Hamas, and as such they will continue the funding. It has nothing to do with the funding of Hamas by Iran. It is mutually exclusive. This money has been going to ensure that the United Nations Welfare, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Welfare Agency, ensures that its work in Gaza, the whole of Palestine, goes unhindered, and it equally goes to PLO to ensure that it's able to pay its workers in Ramallah in West Bank. So the EU will continue that funding. Since they have carried out an investigation and they are convinced. So it has nothing to do with Iran, Lebanon, Syria, or Yemen.
That sounds a bit reassuring, and we hope it stays that way. But what's not reassuring is news about 3 Palestinians killed in an Israeli strike on the West Bank. And that apart, there have been reports of the Hezbollah group in Lebanon also targeting Israeli installations amid this war as well. Does this worry you about a larger scale of the prosecution of this war in the Gaza Strip following the involvement of these groups? And perhaps what are the implications in the long term?
Yes, it worries me because if Hezbollah enters the war, it will be a different kettle of fish. And the Americans will be put in a dilemma whether to intervene or not to intervene, as they have already carriers in the Mediterranean. So it has also been reported the Wagner Group, the classified U.S. intelligence information, has it that the Wagner Group is about giving Hezbollah surface to air missiles through Syria. And if that happens, it will make the war harder. So that is an impregnable front for Israel. And Israel might need external help to be able to confront Hezbollah. As for West Bank, I think it is under Israeli security control, though administratively it is under the Palestine Liberation Organization. So it is not new that 3 Palestinians have been killed. That front had always been expected to rear its ugly head by Israel, and I think Israel had always been prepared for the West Bank. The joker is Hezbollah in Lebanon. They've organized up to 60 attacks on Israel, and not only infrastructures have been destroyed, but also some Israelis have been killed and wounded. So if this continues, Israel has said that it will revisit the Lebanese attack. You recall in the 1980s, and thereafter Israel had cause to encroach on Lebanon. So how far it can go, nobody knows. But Israel in its war mood now is ready to do anything. But if it attacks Lebanon and Syria comes in, and through the proxies of Iran, and Houthis are already attacking from Yemen. They are where they have seized an Israeli-linked ship in the Red Sea. So the escalation is there, but to what extent it will go on a daily basis, nobody can really predict. But this is war, anything can happen. So let's expect that Hezbollah will continue to exercise restraint without putting foot on the ground. I mean, its soldiers to cross the border between Lebanon and Israel. If that happens, that will be a war in very significant dimension, of which may draw in several countries, the end of which in the long term, nobody can predict. But for now, Israel had done it before in 1947. They had done it before in 1956 during the Israel-Egypt Suez Canal rift that involved France and some other countries. Israel did it in 1967, the Six-Day War. Israel did it in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. Whether Israel will be able to do it again is left for history to determine.
And if all of this happens, which we sincerely and honestly hope that it does not, what would happen to the other countries in the Middle East? Would they still be able to retain that neutrality that we see on the surface, but that even most experts doubt? And I mean, the other countries in the region like Qatar, like United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. What would happen? Would they be compelled to join in this war? And on which side would they be, perhaps?
One can look at this. It will be quite complicated because the Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. So the Arabs, they will find it difficult to join an Iranian proxy. So they may still be neutral and allow Hezbollah to do its fight. Hezbollah will have sufficient armory from Iran, from Syria to fight Israel, even without the intervention of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and some other, like Bahrain, Qatar, so they can fight Israel without them. But whether they will defeat Israel is a different kettle of fish. I doubt whether they will be able to defeat Israel, but they can try if they receive sufficient support to sufficiently damage Israel to a point it had never been done before. So one is praying that that kind of escalation will not happen, because you cannot completely predict certain countries whether they will remain neutral or not, because Iran may use the Wagner group through Syria, and if the Wagner group enters the war, or Turkey supports Hezbollah, at the end of the day, definitely Israel will see this war as one of the hottest, especially since Hamas and Hezbollah are not states to be called up to the United Nations Security Council. They are non-state actors. So there is a limit to which the activities can be called into question. And you recall each time Hezbollah attacks, Iran denies that they didn't send them. So even if you meet and say Iran is supporting them, Iran will say we are not supporting them, and it will be difficult to call the Hezbollah leadership to United Nations to warn them or to do anything against them. So it's a tricky one, but we hope that countries that have leverage over them, like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, can call this thing to order, so that we don't get to a point that we begin to consider whether we are on the presence of a third world war. I think we won't get to that point.
And that leaves very little to the imagination when you begin to consider what position the Western powers would take if this escalation that we'll talk about happens. And just to add very quickly, to your initial commentary about Yemen seizing a ship, we also know that Japan has come up to say that that ship belonged to it, that it's not an Israeli linked ship. But speaking of what could also happen beyond this war, particularly following this truce and Prime Minister Netanyahu's insistence that Israel will continue with this war until it achieves its aim, what do you suppose would happen to the Netanyahu-led government after this war? Will it still retain its mandate, or the end of this war may also mean the end of the Benjamin Netanyahu administration?
If Netanyahu is unable to bring back all the hostages, the government will fall at a time. Because another strong man in Israel will come up to say, oh, if I were the premier, I would have brought back all the hostages. And the grieving public, the grieving families will say, okay, let's try another chance. Let's try another candidate. So to the extent that all the hostages are released and Israel takes over security control of at least northern Gaza, the Netanyahu government will survive. But we have currently a unity cabinet in Israel, and that unity cabinet is just for the purpose of this war. At the end of the war, the politicians in the cabinet will continue their struggle. And the Israeli population is sometimes unpredictable. So Netanyahu lost his brother during the Entebbe raid in Uganda in the 1970s. So Alanti has also lost a relation in Gaza right now. So he has tasted the bitter part of war. The people have confidence in him now, but everything will still be dependent on whether he'll be able to get back the hostages. If the war gets to war of attrition, and for 6 months the hostages are not back, for 1 year the hostages are not back, it seems to me that certainly the Netanyahu government will fall.
But, just to quickly add to your trail, if the hostages are released, could it give some form of credibility to the government and engender some form of sympathy from the Israeli people to the Netanyahu-led government?
Sure. It will have a clement effect on his government, and his government will say we have achieved the purpose of the war. We were able to close some tunnels in Gaza. We've also been able to bring back the hostages. To the people of Israel, bringing back the hostages is #1 requirement for sustainable government in Israel. The second one is to ensure that October 7 does not repeat itself. Recall that between 1939 and 1945, about 6 million Jews were exterminated in Germany. And after that, they said never again, and the United Nations also said never again. That led to the partition resolution of the UN in 1947, which the Palestinians rejected. And eventually in 1948, the state of Israel was declared. So that never again, what the ghost of the Second World War came back on October 7. One will need to go into history to really understand how the people of Israel feel. What they thought they had done away with, that will never occur again, came back on October 7. So it's a survivalist war. It is a war that they can't afford to lose. They've put everything on the table, and they need to establish that war will not be brought to their table in a way that is not on their own terms. So certainly this will be a redefinition of the never again that was said after the Second World War. October 7 is a ghost that will continue to hover like the sword of Damocles over the necks of the people of Israel. And the only thing that will make them assuage their fear, their feeling, is for the purpose of the war to be achieved. If not achieved, definitely something must give. And Netanyahu's government will be one of the casualties.
The question is, if things were to be on their own terms, how much will be too much considering the other interests, in this war? But we'll continue this conversation some other time. It's as if it's endless as the war continues. We'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Chukwuemeka, as a former lecturer in the Nasarawa State University. Thank you so much for your time and contributions on the program.
Thank you, Bukola. Thank you very much.
And still to come on our program today, Gazan mother losing hope of seeing child finally reunites with her newborn. More details later. Join us again. Welcome back. A funeral has been held for a 26-year-old Israeli soldier, staff captain, Arnon Moshe Vaspi. Vaspi was killed during a military operation in Gaza Strip. According to Israeli tallies, about 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, were killed in Hamas's shock attack on October the 7th assault, the deadliest day in the country's 75-year history. A total of 64 Israeli soldiers have died in the conflict, That's according to the latest army count. May his soul rest in peace. International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach is closely monitoring the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict ahead of the Olympic Games in Paris next year. Speaking in New York on Tuesday after the United Nations voted to adopt the Olympic truce, Bach said he was in contact with both the Israel and Palestine National Olympic Committees, with the IOC undertaking all the efforts to protect the athletes of both organizations. Bach added the IOC is also keeping a close eye on the potential impact the conflict may have on Paris 2024.
Go ahead and ask your question. Well, first of all, I think all humanity, we are feeling and suffering with the innocent victims of this conflict. With regard to our remit, which is about sport and the Olympic movement, we are in the position that in the Olympic movement we have, if you want, the two-state solution. We have a National Olympic Committee of Israel and we have a National Olympic Committee of Palestine. And therefore we are in contact with both National Olympic Committees and undertaking all the efforts to protect the athletes of both National Olympic Committees and to protect the Olympic communities in both National Olympic communities, in both National Olympic Committees, sorry. And for the rest, we are monitoring closely the potential impact this conflict, this war may have with regard to relocation of events or postponement of sports events for security reasons. I have spoken about what you are saying. Dire is the state of the world. It's not the state of the Olympic movement. What I wanted to express there is that in such dire moments for the world, and I think that we all agree that we had hardly any time after World War II with so much confrontation, conflict and wars, that in such a time this mission of the Olympic movement, of the Olympic Games, is even more important than ever. And therefore, we are really overwhelmed by this support expressed by the UN General Assembly, having not a single vote against this our mission, and having only 2 abstention, I think is a very clear signal that the international community, that the world is really longing for something unifying among all these tensions and confrontations.
At first, the young mother couldn't find her newborn son, Anas, among the 31 tiny babies who had just arrived in southern Gaza after being evacuated from Gaza City's devastated Al-Shifa hospital. She hadn't seen him for 45 days. Warda Sibeta said she was losing hope. She and her husband frantically checked the list of names provided by the head of the neonatal unit where the babies were being cared for at a hospital in Rafah. And there it was, Anas's name in black and white. Sibeta says she felt alive again, grateful to God that their baby is now safely in their care. Sibeta, 32, has 7 older children, and the family whose home was in Gaza City before the war is now living in a school in Khan Yunis, southern Gaza, that has become a shelter for hundreds of people displaced from the north of the Strip. Sibeta was offered the option of being evacuated to Egypt with Anas so he could receive further medical care, but she does not want to leave her husband and other children. And that's it on the program today. And let's remember to spare prayerful thought for the infants, the suffering, the wounded and the bereaved amid this Israel-Gaza conflict. Thank you so much for watching today. Join us again same time tomorrow when we bring you another edition of our continuing coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. I am Bukola Koka. Bye for now.